Welcome everyone to ICOR's April webinar on the post-pandemic workforce. We all know that remote working has become the norm during 2020, at least for some of us, and I'm assuming our audience here are people that work in an office, because we do know that a lot of people have not been able to work remotely. But so this audience, this presentation is directed at an audience that does work in an office. But one of the things we really need to consider is that as organizations reimagine the post-pandemic organization, the impact of how the workforce returns to work, and you also need to look at determining when remote work works and when it doesn't, and all of that is really top of mind. So in this webinar today, we're going to discuss the positive and negative aspects of remote working and factors to consider when building a more resilient and flexible workforce. My name is Linda Nelson, and I am the president of ICOR, and I regularly do these webinars. And I work as a volunteer with the U.S. TAG and ICOR liaison for ISO Technical Committee 292 on Security and Resilience. We are actually starting to do some work on a new standard that talks about organizational resilience strategies. And I am the author of ICOR's Certified Organizational Resilience series of courses. Our objective today is to explore the positive and negative aspects of remote working and factors to consider when building a more resilient and flexible workforce. The recording of the webinar will be available on the ICOR webpage within 2 days. It's usually up the next day, but we always say 2 days just to make sure, so by Friday. If you have questions, use the questions button. I will try to answer any questions at the end of the webinar. I will give you a warning that there's so much content for this webinar that I actually had about 3 hours worth of content that I have knuckled down to be less than an hour, I'm hoping, but we'll see. Otherwise, we'll answer in an email after the webinar. And you do receive a certificate of attendance, but you need to attend at least 35 minutes. So let's go ahead and get started. So which one best describes you? This picture actually came from a discussion I was having around the holiday dinner table a couple weeks ago, and one person around the table said, "Oh my gosh, if I have 3 virtual meetings in a day, I am so exhausted I can't do anything else." And the other person said, "Well, if I don't have any meetings, I can't get motivated and do anything." And so it's really, really important that you understand how you like to work and how often you like interacting with others, because this impacts where and how you do your best work. And I want you to kind of keep this in the back of your mind as we go through today's presentation. I think that you probably already know the answer to this, but what we're really seeing is that as the remote work has gone on in duration, that people are having different opinions about remote work. And some of them very positive and some of them very negative. So it's really pretty much into different ballparks there. So consider this, because this is going to be a really important question for both the employees and the employers. There's a lot of talk about remote working in the news and looking at this hybrid model. I usually start off the presentations with a definition, but in this case, the definition was pretty straightforward. Working remotely is working from home or some other location. And hybrid work is a combination where you have the option to work at the office sometimes and work from an alternate location other times, whether it's your home or somewhere else. There are some very specific steps that are being shared by a lot of different organizations on how to prepare for this return to the office. And even in Singapore, like they've published a specific playbook for bringing bankers back to the office. Like I said, there's a ton. We have probably 3 times the references that we actually use in this webinar, just because there was not enough time. And so one of the things that we'll do is, for all the source content and for even the source content that we didn't use, we will share that with you when you get your webinar certificate. We'll send you either a slide or just the copy and paste of the links so that you have those, because one of the things that we're seeing is that there's some consistent data coming out. It's really interesting to see that, because sometimes you don't see it. And so it's worth reading. But in the background, what I want you to see here is that published by US Today in January, that nearly 30% of working professionals um, say that they're going to quit if they have to return to the office. And I believe this is full time after the pandemic. And these numbers are actually changing. Um, you'll see in some of the presentations that those numbers are even higher. But one thing we know is that, remote working is not new. Even before the pandemic, there were over 5 million people in the US alone working from home at least half the time. And when you look at all the different jobs, and this came from Forbes, and it was specifically a study done in the US, but I would assume that this is somewhat similar around the world, is that there are jobs that at least partially compatible for remote work. So about half, a little bit more than half of the jobs out there. And one of the big sellers for remote working is that employers have been realizing that they're saving money for every person who works remotely at least half time. So again, we're looking at numbers, how they're being presented. So about 5% of Americans worked or are working from home. This is from a study done by Great Place to Work, and they do an annual survey. During the pandemic, that kind of ranged from 16 to 16, I should say, since March of 2020. This has ranged from between 16 and 65%, depending on kind of the lockdown situation. And what we don't know what it's going to be after. We really don't know. I would assume that it's going to be higher than 5% and less than 65%. But this is really what this webinar is all about, is companies really aren't sure, and then they need to be figuring this out right now. So what's really happened is that there's been a shift in where work takes place. And when I say work, and I'm just going to remind you, this is kind of office work. The virus has broken through cultural and technological barriers that in the past have prevented remote work. And so this has really set in motion as what we're calling a structural shift in where work takes place. And again, at least for some people. And so our May webinar is going to focus on the workplace and in planning for the shift of where people work. SHRM deals with HR-related issues, and one of the things that they're noting is that historically there's been a perception in many organizations that if employees were not seen, they weren't working, kind of this trust issue, or at least they weren't working as effectively as they would in an office. What has been found, however, is that workers have proven themselves more than capable of handling flexible work options during a crisis. And this is even, considering this is not just a little crisis, it's been a long crisis. So you've had to deal with the stress of the crisis, the stress of working from home. Then you may have, children, spouses, partners, roommates, all these other people trying to work in the same space. And, I've heard from so many people that, they're working across the kitchen table from somebody else in their home. And even just managing Zoom calls has been crazy just because of the noise itself. And so what we need to know is that companies are going to need to continue fostering that sense of freedom and control that flexible work options provide. And they need to build strong, flexible work programs. And this is something we're going to talk about over and over again. It is pretty much the overriding theme of this webinar. And when we're looking at organizational resilience, we talk about being adaptive, agile, flexible. And so this is really coming into a new level when we're talking about how we work and where we work as well. This is kind of on the negative side. So the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago, they had a blog, and really the focus was on what we're losing by working remotely. And so some of the negative aspects has to do with what we're calling efficiency. So this is a quote. She said, "Recently I was watching Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, a great show to watch. And it was the first episode produced from his house, and he was joking about the process. He said, it's been 2 weeks because it takes a really long time to produce comedy when you're not all in the same room, ripping on each other's jokes, making cuts and iterating live. And I have to say that I watch a lot of comedy and a lot of late night shows, and maybe now because I'm not commuting as much. But the fact is that it's really hard to be a comedian when you don't have an audience. And so, this this really pertains to working in teams and that interaction you have with other people in your office. And what he's saying is it's just so much faster when you can do it in person. We see these examples everywhere in all types of circumstances, and we need to measure them. So this is part of it. We're saying that, by the way, some of the work that we didn't include was on productivity. There was a lot of studies being done on productivity. And what they're finding is that there's plenty of productivity is equal or more than what they had when they were working on site. However, people are spending more time working. So that idea of efficiency. Um, you know, we're working with technology, but it's not the same. And we're going to talk some more about that as well. So understanding that in any environment where you're working in a team on an ongoing basis, you need to build trust with your team members. And so there's also an impact on relationships. And it's extremely hard to build trust in a virtual environment, especially if you didn't have a pre-existing relationship with that person. So some of what we're going to talk about today ties back to your company's culture and your leadership and how resilient or how strong was it before. So starting a new team with it being totally remote is very, very difficult. But if you have a team that's working well and you've been working well for a long time, it probably wasn't so difficult and your impact on relationships wasn't that big of a deal. So it's a lot of it, it's tied to that pre-existing relationship. And we know that trust is built through a series of interactions over the long run, and that a lot of that can only be done when you see people in person. Um, this might not be totally politically correct, but I've talked to a lot of my friends who have been through divorce, and one of the things that had been often stated was, for the parent who didn't get custodial was, well, we have really quality time now. It's just the one or two, however many kids and me. We're totally focused. Where at home there was a lot of distractions. But what they're really finding out is that quantity time is sometimes more important than quality time because it takes time to build trust, and you need that, and that quantity time um, is an important aspect of that. For a lot of people, it's that impact on motivation and energy, for just even getting up and going to work every morning to go sit in the dining room as opposed to going to a place where there's other people, there's energy in the room, there's excitement, and you can see in this case, this was an educator talking about the learning happening in front of your eyes. Because we know that humans are social, and socializing with pixels is hard. It's just different. And it's not something that can't be done. We've seen it happening. We've seen it happening well. It's just when it's happening and that's your only way of socializing that I think becomes the issue. So looking at remote work as an option, but looking at it as not the only option for a lot of people. Because you need that sense of belonging and that energy and feedback you get, and being in person with teams. And this becomes really, really important, and you can't just replace it with technology. It can be supplemented by technology, and make it better, but it isn't a replacement. So I wanted just to mention really quickly about new hires. I know that there hasn't been as much hiring as usual going on in the past year, but there have been new hires. And for new hires, it's been especially difficult. They don't know anyone. And so, they don't even get peer recognition because they're kind of just on their own out there and they don't have any relationships. They also because they haven't had that opportunity to spend time in the office, they don't understand the culture of the company. And so they're going to be less likely to feel that culture and understand the company's values. So understanding when you're hiring, that remote onboarding is going to be different, and that you're going to need to consider how you do that, especially if we move to a hybrid work, or where you have a lot of people working remotely and you're still doing hiring. You're going to need to consider what's the best way to do that, and what's the best way for people who work remotely to get an idea of the organization's culture and feel like they're part of that organization. So to work remotely or not work remotely, and that is the question of the day. And I really felt that reading through all of this, it's about having choice. And what we lost with this pandemic was the choice. And I think that's what's caused a lot of anxiety for people, is when you have a lot of change, being able to manage that change and feeling like you have choices is really, really important. So prior to 2020, we knew that working from home was a choice rather than a necessity, and a lot of organizations offered alternatives. And it kind of helped people to self-sort, where people who liked working remotely chose that, and people that didn't. And there might be a lot of, different reasons for that, like your commute, maybe you don't even have a physical space to work remotely, how much you meet with people, as well as just your basic kind of personality, your introvert, extrovert type of thing. And so what we need to do and recognize is that people value flexibility, and they value options. And so the future role for the office may be to kind of operate more as a social theater, where people can get together and get their in-person contact when needed, and then go back and do some of their work remotely. So this idea of seeing you sometimes or more often, depending on your comfort level and what your job looks like. And so one of the challenges out there for employers is they're going to need to be able to differentiate themselves by their ability to offer choices. And we're going to talk some more about that as well, because there has been a big virtual reset. And part of that is, they don't even know how to measure employee performance when you don't see people. And everything gets down to productivity, but what does that look like? One of the positive things that has been reported is that there's been less office politics, because people aren't interacting, much less gossip. And so another positive thing is that companies need to really consider how to be more meritocratic. I've never actually seen that word before, and talent centric. Manpower actually reported that this world of talent is trending towards kind of this customization and personalization of work. And this is really incompatible with making everyone work remotely or making everybody be in the office. And so this goes back to, employers are going to need to differentiate themselves by their ability to offer choices. So there were quite a few studies. This one is one I picked because it was specifically about careers, and it wasn't from a company, a specific company itself, but also because their data lined up really nicely with other data that I was finding. So one of the things that I think every company needs to understand is what's been the overall impact on employees' well-being with this prolonged work from home. And so there's just some data here for us to consider, that 81% of people working remotely enjoy that. 65% said that it impacted their work-life balance, and that was a main thing that was really important to them. Asking the question, has your mental health deteriorated since you started to work in a remote capacity? I thought it was really interesting here that 45% said no. They felt really good about it. And then you have 37% that said yes. And then you've got your 18% in the middle. So, top of mind here is that 37% of people being less well, and impacted negatively. You need to consider that in your decisions, but you also need to consider that some people are really doing well and thriving with this new environment. They asked, what's the most significant challenge for remote employees? And I think everybody can agree that home distractions are the largest. And I've heard from so many people that I'm like, well, how can you be distracted at home? Like, you live alone. And the answer is, yeah, but like there's dishes sitting over there, or I can see cobwebs and things that I just didn't worry about. All of a sudden, I felt the need. I've got to start cleaning. And so whether you have kids at home and you're supposed to be teaching them as well, or you're taking care of family members, or you're just are easily distracted, maybe remote work isn't a good thing for you. A lot of people have trouble staying motivated, and one of the things that I anecdotally have heard from so many people is this communication, collaboration, like kind of loneliness feeling. And that's been exacerbated by the fact that people have just been lonely in general because they haven't even been able to see their friends. But this unplugging after work is really key, because when I mentioned earlier that productivity is up, and that's because people are actually working more. I also was surprised by lack of creativity being only 11%. A lot of other data out there and anecdotal data is saying that people are getting their jobs done. They're doing their work. What they're not doing is being creative and innovative. Maybe they are in response to the pandemic itself, but they haven't been creative and innovative with improving their jobs or how they're doing their work. And so this is something I think, even though this study only says 11%, I think it's something that we need to consider is how do we make sure that people are able to be creative and innovative, because your company doesn't just need their tasks done, they need their people to be creating new things for them too. Some of the more positive things, and you'll see that this is kind of data that's being validated by other areas as well. Temporarily remote working professionals, so people that didn't work from home before have really enjoyed the flexibility. I don't see how you can take away the flexibility and the improved work-life balance that people feel. Obviously, because of the pandemic, people have felt safer. So I think that would probably be a statistic that may go away once, you know, the risk is gone or at least greatly reduced. But 29% feel more productive. And there's actually 10% of people that have acquired new skills, which I thought was actually kind of a surprise. We talked about communication. Um, Almost half the people said their communication hasn't changed. 31% have said it's improved, and 23% said it's deteriorated. And here is where I think this idea of intentional communication has made a difference. For those organizations that have understood the fact that they need to communicate more, and that leaders need to actually over communicate when you're not in person, I think that's a really important thing to remember. And that once this pandemic is over and you have still people working remotely or in a hybrid option, there is extra work for leaders and managers to make sure that you're communicating effectively. This is kind of an anecdotal one, but do you feel like the remote work has affected your chance of getting a promotion or a raise? And for most people, they haven't. They said it has not been a negative impact. So only 18%. And I get my suggestion for this would be this would probably be in companies where maybe they haven't had a real healthy culture and or things haven't been going really well um, either. So we still see 87% of working professionals feeling like they have a sense of belonging in their organization, even though they're not working, at the office. And so these are some really positive numbers that very much support that companies need to consider remote work and hybrid work as options. So as part of that, the employers need to look at, do your workers want to return to the office or continue to stay in a remote capacity for good? This is an important question that every employer needs to ask of every employee. Because that we know that most employers are going to be opening their offices if they haven't already done that in some manner, or if they didn't stay open the whole time. A lot of companies did stay open in some manner. Now, I just went and got my taxes done, for example, and yes, the office is open. There's just only one person in the office per day. So, there's all different variations on having your on-site work. However, 79% of people believe that their company is going to want to have everybody come back to work. However, 61% of them want their employer to let them work in a remote capacity indefinitely. That's a big number, and you'll see that number again. 29%, I mentioned 30% earlier, and I think you're going to see 40% coming up, have gone so far as to say they're going to quit their job if they're not allowed to continue working remotely. And then it didn't actually define how long they needed to work remotely, like if it was 1 day a week or 4 days a week or all the time. But I think that's something that needs to be understood. And 60% of people say that in the future, I'll give preference to employers that offer remote work. So think about that as an employer and when you're looking at hiring somebody to work on your team or in your department. So then the question was asked, if going back to the office is inevitable, yes, the office is open, we expect people to be here. How many days a week would you like to be in the office? I thought it was really interesting, kind of the divide here. Either 2 or 3 days is an expectation. For those people that want to work remotely, 55% of them say 2 or 3 days. And the others, and then they say, 1 day is not enough and 4 days is too much. So I think this is interesting. And aside to this is another 61% of remote workers said that they would expect a pay raise if they were no longer allowed to work from home because they feel like they're losing a benefit. So if you expect me to come to work every day, because remember, people have saved money, they haven't had to commute. They've saved time. there's a lot of things that people have appreciated. And now if that's going to cost them money to go back to work and cost them time, then they expect a pay raise. There was one quote that, and I'm sure some of you feel the same way, but, there's nothing that'll ever make me go back. I get to work in whatever clothes I want in the comfort of wherever I want. I don't have to commute. I can do my tasks when and how I choose. They'd have to offer me 500,000 US dollars a year um, in order to get me even to budge on coming back to the office. So I'm sure, this isn't the same for everyone, but I think it's something that you need to ask yourself. And it's something you need to ask the people that work for you and the people that work with you. So the Great Place to Work also talked about what makes companies a great place to work. And not surprisingly, of course, it's culture. So what is the impact of company culture on remote work and productivity? And this is just a little snapshot. They had a lot of data with this. So one of the things is that company culture and leadership is impacts both remote work productivity as well as remote in-person productivity. And this is not a surprise, and it shouldn't be a surprise to any of you. If you've listened to any of our webinars and if you've seen our organizational resilience model, there's the three legs to the stool, and one is culture, one is leadership, and one is managing risk. And so during this pandemic, we've seen the need for all three of those to have a very important part. And we cannot underestimate the importance of company culture and leadership, because in uncertain times, strong leadership is a key factor in maintaining productivity as well as employee well-being. And while the perks have bolstered employee productivity sometimes during those early months of working from home, it's really the camaraderie and positive culture that influence the long-term productivity. So going back to looking at this idea that, productivity may have been up, and we're going to look at a slide for that in a minute, but it's this longer term that's made a difference. So people did pretty well at the beginning, but it's the duration. And it's sort of that same idea of a crisis. Like, we can get through anything in a short period of time, but as the duration extends, it really changes people's capacity and capability to continue. And we were talking about culture earlier this year. We said that, culture is your secret weapon. Well, camaraderie is part of your culture. And so when you've got that, great work, you've got a powerful mission, you've got shared values, this is where productivity soars, because people really believe in their work and they want to continue with that. Um, when times are tough, this is when leaders have the greatest opportunity to build trust. And so this is where leadership continues to be key, because then if they communicate effectively, and they bring people along, and they build people up and they meet their needs, that is something that lasts for a really long time when all the crisis is over. So this is a study that was also done by a Great Place to Work, and what they saw is, March 2020, employer productivity, they kind of measure around 70%, and it jumped to a high of 87% in May. And this is where, April and May and in June, most companies had everybody at home, depending on what state you live in, what country you live in. There were different rules for this, and maybe your timing for this might have been different depending on how the pandemic hit your part of the world. But the fact is that employees were producing really well. But then we saw a huge drop off. And this is something that I think we really felt. I know in the US, we felt it when we realized that schools were not going to open. And then we had to keep going like this. There was a big letdown in August when people realized that, this isn't going to be over anytime soon. And then we saw over the fall, this is globally, by the way, that, the workforce productivity kind of went back up to normal and maybe a bit of an increase. And so this, because the study was done in January, they measured from March to December. But the other thing that happened is, you can't sustain that higher productivity over the duration. And so what we really just saw was kind of a correcting as well, and kind of normalizing productivity while working remotely. And so, companies that were really supportive and had a good culture were seeing this decline. And this is where they double down on helping people with their wellness initiatives and trying to give some support for people. So out of the 800 employees surveyed by Mercer, it's a HR and workplace consulting firm, 94% of them said that productivity was the same as or higher than it was before the pandemic, even with their employees working remotely. So other than that little bit of a dip, kind of in that August, September, October timeframe, um, productivity has remained very stable. And so it's going to be really hard for companies to say that remote work doesn't work for a lot of people. So how do you ensure that remote work is sustainable? We're back to this connected culture piece. You need to feel connected. Ring Central has done some really interesting reporting on culture and remote work. And so you need to make sure that you've got a dedication to building interactivity. And when you do that, the employees report higher levels of productivity as well as well-being. So I'm going to frame some of this data because it's a little bit confusing. I had to read it a few times. But when employees at companies promote a connected culture, so they feel like they're in a good place, they cite better well-being. 55% of them felt like they were doing very well than compared to companies that did not promote that connected culture. So this is around that connected culture theme and why it's so important. 71% who actually feel more connected are more productive. So this idea of being connected to work increases productivity. And so that, but remember, these are people self-reporting. So we haven't had a lot of evaluations on how this is going from the employer standpoint, but employers did report in the other study that people were more productive. So I think that's a consistent piece of data. Some people are actually feeling more connected to their colleagues than before, so, which is kind of interesting. That's 71% to 22%. That was a surprise to me. And 34% of those who reported working at companies that foster a connected culture say that they're more productive working from home. So again, this idea when you don't feel connected, you have a much lower number of people feeling productive. I do want to say that this productivity is not an equal playing field. So number one, women feel less connected. And I'm not going to go into all the reasons why that could be, but there's been definite differences between men and women in how they've been able to get by through this pandemic, as well as how they feel their level of happiness and emotional well-being. Nearly half of employees have struggled with group work, and this is where we talk about the need for that interaction with people, and that some type of work requires more interaction than others. And so when you're looking at what type of work should be done in the office and what type of work can be done remotely, this becomes a real differentiator. So looking at any group work, if you work all on teams all the time, you're probably going to be much more likely to want to be on site than people who tend to do more tasks and information gathering types of things. The company interaction, about 28% of the people struggled with that. And also for women, group tasks or work performed among teams had more people struggling, almost, more than 10%, again, like we saw earlier. So this is something that companies need to address and try to figure out the cause for that within their own company. About a third, just about almost 40%, said that their companies attempted to help them feel connected so that they could complete their work, including group-based work. 53% reported that they did not make any attempt. So this is kind of, kind of a sad thing that some companies really worked at it and some companies just sent people home and didn't really provide them much support. So this data is based on employees who reported high levels of emotional well-being, say that they're the same or more productive working from home. So being able to measure emotional well-being of your employees is something that you should be looking at. Our January webinar really focused a lot on employee well-being, and so if you haven't seen that one, take a look at it. 58% of companies who say their companies are making an attempt to help them feel connected say they feel physically healthy. So again, people who are emotionally healthy feel good about working from home. People whose companies make an attempt to help them feel better about things, and people who are, emotionally healthy say that they feel more connected to employees. So this measurement of employee well-being is a really important aspect for you to consider. So when we're looking at the sustainability of remote work, what they have found is that there's actually remote champions. So about 10% of the workforce would be considered a remote champion. And these are people who really thrive with chaos, and they really thrive working remotely. And this is kind of interesting attributes of them. They're clear communicators, which makes sense. They're structured routine followers, so where they work doesn't matter. You know, they're not easily distracted. They also tend to be more open-minded and willing to try other things. So maybe kind of that agile, adaptive type of thing. They're also very good at working with other people, so collaborators. But I found this fifth one really interesting, is that they also tend to be introverts. So while when you kind of look at yourself, is yeah, I really like working from home, but when I'm collaborating with people, I want it scheduled, and I'm good with that, and I'm very able to do that, and then I want to be done. So kind of like, what's your maximum number of Zoom or team meetings that you can handle in a day? Understanding that, because a lot of introverts are the people that work really well from home, but they're also, ironically, very good communicators, and they tend to collaborate well. So understanding this is another key factor to look at. The other thing I found really interesting was that caretakers reported higher levels of well-being versus non-caretakers. So I always think of caretakers as people who have a lot of extra work to do managing family and whoever they're caretaking for. They also reported higher levels of productivity. When I'm just, some of this is really confounding to me, and I think it's really important for people to understand that sometimes what you think is true maybe isn't really true. And the people, kind of like when you say, you know, if you need something done, give it to somebody who's busy because they'll just get it done. They have a way of managing a lot of things, and maybe this is part of the case here as well. But they also said that 32% of caretakers felt more connected to their teams in a remote work environment than their non-caretaker counterparts. So the outcome of this is really that caretakers are much more likely to be more productive in remote work than non-caretakers. And there are some reasons for that. And we're going to talk about some of those reasons coming up. Because, you know, one of the things that a lot of caretakers have struggled with is balancing their time because they have to go back and forth to the office and managing scheduling of the people that they're caring for. And so they feel like they have much greater work-life balance. They can manage their caretaking on their own time versus at a scheduled time, kind of like I was talking about before, that flexibility of choosing when to work and when you get your work done is really, really important. So we know that we have to get back to normal, and how are you going to do that at work? And so let's take a look at hybrid work. And this is, like I said before, part-time at the office, part-time at home. There's a lot of variations. We all know that you can't beat the commute, that, you know, most everyone is eager to get back to the office in some way, just to, you know, just to have those interactions with people. But understanding also that some have moved to places from which they cannot now easily come to the office. I'll just speak about Chicago. Downtown Chicago is empty. Like, you can get an apartment anywhere, you can get a condo anywhere, you can get a flat anywhere. They're open, and you can get it for a much better price than you could in January of 2020. And you cannot find a house out in the suburbs. They're only on the market for a very short time, sometimes only a day or two before they're sold. So do those people want to go back and commute to the office? And this is where Microsoft, and we're going to be looking at Microsoft's study that they've done. They're actually saying that the next great disruption is going to be hybrid work. And are we ready? Are companies ready for this? Because we've seen, you know, a year like no other for work. We've seen some trends that leaders really need to consider. One of the things, you know, everybody's kind of learning as they go, but you have to understand that flexible work is not going away. And so this is going to change how we work. So in their study, they found that 73% of workers wanted a flexible work options to continue, while at the same time, 67% are craving more in-person time with their teams. So this is really important messaging. Again, what kind of work needs to be done where? And this idea of extreme flexibility and hybrid work is going to define post-pandemic workplace. And so employees are going to want control. They've had control. They're going to want to keep it over where, when, and how they work. And they expect businesses to provide options. The sad part of this is that 42% of employees said that they've actually lacked the office essentials needed to get their work done. And 1 in 10 of those don't even have an adequate internet connection to do their job. So when you're looking at productivity, there are some people that have not been able to be productive, and they could have been more productive if the corporation or the company had provided them what they needed. And so that time has passed. And so if people are going to continue to work remotely, there's going to have to be a commitment of resources from the company to make that more effective. But there was another piece of data that said only 40% of workers said that their employer helps them with remote work expenses, so that if you've had to upgrade your space and to do the work, less than half of companies have provided you any benefits to do that or any resources to do that. So in this work trend index that they published in 2021, 66% say that their company is considered redesigning office space for hybrid work. So again, that'll be our topic for next month. And they understand that impromptu encounters at the office help keep leaders honest also. But you also have fewer chances to just ask, hey, how you doing? And it's hard to pick up, physical cues if you're just talking remotely. And so we really need to look at the people who are struggling and find new ways to help them, because we know that not everyone is struggling. So the people that are need your attention. One of the things we know is that leaders are faring better than employees, and you can probably guess that. The immediate thing is that leaders are in charge. When you have control, or more control than others, you're going to feel better, and therefore you're going to fare better. And so 61%, the kind of the blue to purple, is showing how people are feeling about how they're doing. And what I just wanted to show you here is that most everybody else is not faring as well. And so we're looking at people who are single, probably feeling very isolated, especially if they're living alone. And those new employees, we're going to talk about those Gen Z and new employees as well. Another study is that we know that digital overload continues, and it is climbing. So if you look to the left, meeting minutes per person back in March compared to meeting minutes per person in December, the number of documents you need to work on, how often you're chatting, how much email, how many meetings you're attending, all of those things are up. And so one of the things that's happening is that high productivity is kind of masking this exhausted workforce. And so we're kind of going back to this duration piece. People are holding on. They have some hope that this is going to end, and so they're continuing. But the fact is that we can't continue at this pace long term. And so we need to have a really good understanding of how to manage time for both the on-site worker and the remote worker and the hybrid worker. There are 2 countries that have seen less of an increase in meetings, and this is both in Australia, and I think there's some data on New Zealand as well as China. And this is something that we can look for. Australia, they only had to have 1 hard shutdown, and they've had hardly any cases of COVID, and so they've been able to open up. And they also saw that because a lot of companies were doing hybrid before, that it was much easier to do hybrid currently. And so understanding that because companies in those countries have spent more time in hybrid work environments, it wasn't as difficult for them. And so this might give us some hints for the future. But I really think you need to be looking and considering your Generation Z, your youngest workers. Here we often think about them as being the screen people. And so ironically, they actually say that they're struggling more than older generations. And a part of that's probably going to be maturity, relationships. The causes for this are not just the pandemic, but the fact is that they felt less engaged or excited about work. They have more trouble getting a word in during conference calls or meetings. And this is part of what I'm talking about with women as well, is that our virtual meetings maybe aren't quite as fair or as equitable as in-person meetings. And the subtle cues about people wanting to say something get missed. And I've noticed that in a lot of meetings that I've been in, is that it's much quieter. There's much less interaction and much less discussion on things or even conflict on things. People are just kind of going along. And so Generation Z has also really struggled with bringing new ideas to the table. And so I think this is something we need to think about. Everyone struggled in this aspect of work, but the younger the employee is and the less time they've had there, it could be an older employee who's had less time. You might see some of those same attributes. And this goes back to this kind of corporate culture company piece as well. If you had really strong networks when you started, when you had close-knit team members, you did much better than people who were now on new teams or hadn't really worked in teams before, or they didn't interact as much, so their interactions weren't as often, and they didn't have the same sorts of bonds. So you see that their productivity is lower, and kind of that innovation piece as well. And so in just understanding and recognizing that teams have become more siloed. And so we need to address that. And how can we unsilo some of those teams? Because we know that when you lose connections and you stop innovating. And that goes back to when I was saying earlier, I really thought that innovation and creativity was going to get a higher piece of this. I did mention New Zealand before. So again, they weren't impacted as much. They're an island. They're a smaller country, and what they're seeing is once they've moved to the hybrid model, they've seen a big reduction in their isolation. An interesting piece of this is on the other side. We're talking about lack of connections, but we're also finding that this tough year made people more human. And so what they're finding is 1 in 6 or 17% of people have actually cried with a coworker, remotely, of course. And when you're looking at where those people work, we're looking at educators, people in travel and tourism who got really hit hard by this, and people in healthcare, kind of the people on the front lines that have felt a lot of stress. And, coworkers have had to lean on each other in new ways. And one of the things I thought was kind of humorous, and maybe it's not really humorous, but it's just more humanizing, is that, if you've been on a lot of, Zoom or Teams or whatever calls, and you've seen a little glimpse into where people are working and to their home life. And this has made people more real than who's actually what that person, quote, looks like in the office. And so I think that that's something people have maybe become more authentic. And now that you can build on that when people go back into the office. You know, they said that, been encouraged to bring your whole self back to the office, but it's really tough to do that. And so this shared vulnerability has given us an opportunity to maybe be more authentic and to build stronger relationships. And I think this will actually really help a lot of company cultures if you have people that are able to do that. But while it's made people more human, it isn't had that, again, not done equally. So when they looked at difficulties building relationships with their direct team, Blacks and Latinos in the U.S. found that more difficult than your white or not, your white or Caucasian people. And so here, looking at 12% versus 19 and 18%, those are big numbers. And feeling included, again, some big numbers there. Not so much compared to Black versus white, 20 and 21%, but Latino people feeling included. And this is actually interesting that they're less likely to bring their authentic selves to work than a year ago. We were just talking about some people have actually felt stronger about that. And this is where you saw the biggest numbers. And so, this idea that there's a gap. We have gap between men and women. We have gaps between people of color and people not of color, and leaders and non-leaders. And the companies, this is back to that corporate culture and how important diversity and all those other aspects are to your workplace and to your workers. The last piece of the webinar is really going to focus on what does talent look like in a hybrid world. And so we know that remote work and those migration patterns of people moving out of the cities and into the suburbs and people maybe moving away from where they work has opened up a lot of interesting jobs to people who may have otherwise not had opportunity to gain access to them. So there's become remote opportunities are more attractive to diverse applicants. So they have opportunities for jobs that they might not otherwise have based on where they live and where the job is. Again, we've seen data on how many people are planning on moving, leaving their companies, or moving to a new, just moving. And this idea of remote work is going to be important because you no longer have to leave your desk a lot of times, or your house or community, to expand your career opportunities. And this should enable organizations to build some high-performing, diverse teams, because you should have a much bigger talent pool now if you effectively implement more of a hybrid work world. Because companies in major cities can now hire from underrepresented groups that may not have the means or desire to move to a big city. And in some smaller cities, companies may now have access to talent that they might not have been able to get before. So looking at that influx and outflux of talent, where people don't have to leave their desk or home to change jobs. And so companies, I think you really need, and leaders really need to think about this as they look at their strategy for more of a hybrid work model. Again, this data we see again with another study about people considering leaving their employers. So understanding having a hybrid approach is going to impact whether those people stay or not. They're seeing job switching intent nearly doubled. Whether those people follow through or not is a different thing, but this idea that as soon as I can change jobs, I'm going to. And understanding that businesses can lose an unprecedented number of employees right now. And so understanding how you return people to work, you want to minimize that impact. And that's why Microsoft was saying that, the hybrid work could become our next crisis if it's not handled correctly at your company. So some of the things that you need to ask people, how are you doing? What do you need? Um, I would imagine that everybody is going to say, yes, I can work remotely, whether they want to or not, because they have been. But back to that choice piece, who will need to come to the office, and for what amount of time? So you need really looking down, kind of doing a job analysis. And this is where the McKinsey study really went through and looked at different jobs and their tasks and what makes sense. But I don't think this is really brain surgery either. I think you can talk to your people. I think you can talk to yourself and say, when do I need to be in the office? What kinds of work should I be doing in the office? And when do I do better work um, out of the office? And look at what that means for your time. So when you do focus type of work, where will you do it? If you're doing work that requires no interruptions, maybe you don't want to be where people are interrupting you all the time. One of my daughter's offices, or her cubicle, is right outside the break room, and she says it's really, really a struggle to focus because everybody feels that they need to stop by and say hello. And sometimes she has to literally go home to get her work done because of all the interruptions. And so this is something that people need to consider. And then, of course, we've got the collaborative work and looking at our teams and the importance of that. Some companies are going to need to rebuild some social capital because it isn't a nice thing to have. It's a business imperative. So you need to encourage and reward your managers and your leaders to help build social capital. We need to support each other. We need to start sharing our learnings. Everybody has learned so much in these past months. And so we need to set aside time to share learnings, to help expand your networks, and check for groupthink. Groupthink is, when you say there's fewer people participating in meetings and fewer people feeling like they are able to contribute because of whatever the environment is in those meetings, that creates groupthink, and that's a really dangerous thing. So we need to reframe how we do team building to more of a proactive one, and we need to have our teams um, seek out perspectives from their neighboring teams. What have they learned? This is about sharing learnings is a really, really important piece of this. So every organization needs to understand that being nice to each other, chatting with each other, and goofing around is not a waste of time. It's not distraction. It's part of the work that we do. It's part of building social capital and culture and people feeling connected to other people. So we're going to need to rethink the employee experience. So what kind of the joke here is that if 2020 was the year of the chief technology officer, then 2021 will be the year of the chief human resources officer. And they really face the greatest new challenge, which is reimagining hiring, onboarding, and this employee well-being in a hybrid world. It's not going to happen by itself. So organizations are going to need to seek to execute more permanent flexibility, and they're going to need to chart a path for that. So they're going to need a strategy and a policy and all sorts of things to go with that. So what does that look like? And how do you measure your growth for that? And you're going to need to rethink your talent acquisition and onboarding process. And then consider how a more flexible workplace will impact your source talent and how are you going to manage compensation? I think that's really interesting that people might actually be willing to work for less if they can work from home, at least part of the time. That to me, that kind of is a winner for everybody. So when we're looking at numbers of who's considering, we need to look at flexibility. It's a great opportunity for the leaders to look at creating a more diverse workforce. And now that, kids will be going back to school if they haven't already, you're going to alleviate some of that at-home responsibilities. Employers can also help by actively seeking female talent. We know a lot of women have left their jobs during this time. And looking very carefully, diversity inclusion, looking at your bias in your job descriptions. And people are really, the younger people have been talking about work-life balance forever, but it is really time for everybody to be able to do that. And I think we lost our work-life balance after 2008 with our last big crisis that hit the world, where people were just trying to hang on to their jobs and they had to do more, and maybe with less money even, and that didn't go away, that stayed. So think about how your wellness programs and work policies affect each group in your organization. When, this moment, I often talk about organizational resilience is about taking advantage of opportunities and opportunities to change. There's been so many opportunities to take advantage of that we didn't have before because so many of these things have just been broken down by the pandemic and been forced on us. It's giving us a great opportunity to rethink things and unlock new ways to achieve everything from, again, that well-being to work-life balance to being more of an inclusive and authentic company culture. And your company will experience better outcomes. We need to embrace extreme flexibility. I kind of thought that as like an athletic event, but we need to follow your data as well. So not just doing what you think, but actually collecting data from your people. And you need to listen to your employees' needs. And you need to create an environment where they feel comfortable sharing what they need, because we need to to create a better future at work for everybody who works for you and for the people that you want to work for you. So you need to be more experimental. We've used the word agile often in everything we talk about with organizational resilience. And because we know that what worked for your people in January of 2020 didn't work for them in April of 2020, and maybe didn't work for them in September of 2020, and it's probably going to be the same in 2021. But what we're doing right now might not be the same as what will work in November. So you need to be agile and taking advantage of these opportunities. I just have a couple of these to share because I thought this one was really interesting, that IBM ended the remote work policy in 2017, and now they're moving forward to a permanent hybrid model. And their goal is to have about 80% of employees working that way. They're still figuring out how to do that. Cisco's decided, we worked remotely, we're going to continue doing this. And so they've decided that since most of its work can be done from anywhere, they've got the technology in place to keep up human connections, and they think that's what their workers want. They're going to continue that. And so work styles drive how employees choose where they work, how they work, and when they work. And so both leaders and employees must be flexible and adapt to meeting those business needs and the employee working style of the organization. As I mentioned, we have a lot of references, so I'm going to ask that all of these just get sent in your certificate. And we have our next webinars coming up. We have a guest speaker on May 5th that's going to talk about effective internet and media monitoring in the context of crisis management. I mentioned our May 19th webinar is going to be on the workplace. And then we're really going to start looking at different strategies for resilience for the rest of the year. We hope you stay connected with us. Obviously, you've got our website, we've got our phone numbers, we've got emails, and a lot of times our iCorrespondence newsletter is connected to what we're doing with our webinars as well. And please join us and follow us. We are 35 seconds early. Let me just give a quick look out to the questions to see if there's anything I could quickly answer. Actually, the only question is, thank you. So we appreciate your coming, and have a great rest of the week.